This online lecture will feature information from Chapter 25, The History of Life. So we are going to talk about the major patterns of the evolution of life over the last 4 billion years or so. And we're going to pay attention to the geologic time scale, like the one here from your textbook. Now, I'm going to talk about some of these periods, like the Cretaceous, Jurassic, Triassic, Permian, Carboniferous, these periods here. But in terms of test material, I want you to focus on the proper order of the eras, including the Precambrian. So we'll call all of this here that fits down at the bottom of this image here, the Precambrian. The reason they have pushed it into its own column is because it's much longer than all of the rest of the eras. So we'll have the Precambrian here, the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic. You need to be responsible for those names in the proper order and the things we talk about that occurred during those eras. Okay, so what do we need to know? Once again, Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic. But I want to point out that those get broken down further into, for example, the Cambrian, Pennsylvania, Mississippi, and Permian. And a few of those will be important to know just because really big things happened at some of those finer scales. For example, the Cambrian Explosion occurs during the Cambrian. So I'll ask you to be familiar with that time frame. So we're talking, once again, let's step backwards, we're talking about a few of the periods we'll know, but not very many. The Cambrian, the Permian we should be familiar with, as well as the Cretaceous. But other than that, Paleozoic, Mesozoic, Cenozoic will be sufficient. And we're going to focus on what happened during these times and what was going on in Arkansas during these times. So note that the Precambrian is 88% of the history of Earth. If you look, we go back 4.6 billion years. If we map this onto a calendar, January 1st at midnight is the beginning of the Precambrian. And it is not until November, the end of November, that we start the Cambrian or the Paleozoic era. And then it's not until December that we hit the Mesozoic, the age of the dinosaurs. And it's not until the very end of December where we hit the Cenozoic, the modern era. And it's not to the last few minutes of the year that humans appear in the fossil record. So first of all, how do we figure out the age of things? It all began with the Law of Superposition. The Law of Superposition didn't allow us to add dates to rocks, but what it did allow us to do is figure out which rocks were older and which rocks were newer. And the Law of Superposition states that the rocks on top are newer than the rocks below them. So when you have rocks in a nice layer, those on top, in sedimentary rocks anyway, are newer. They're younger than the older rocks beneath. So if a fossil appears in an upper rock layer, you know it's newer than fossils found in lower rock layers. Now, more recently, we've been able to analyze isotopes, which are these radioactive variants in of the periodic table that decay into daughter isotopes. So they throw off subatomic particles and they decay into a different isotope. And they do this at a constant known rate. And based on the idea of uniformitarianism that we talked about earlier, we know that things happened in the past like they happen in the present. So we can look at the ratios of parent and daughter isotopes in fossils or in the rocks surrounding fossils and get an estimate of the age of those fossils. And you'll often hear the word half-life, and a half-life is simply a measurement of the time that it takes half of the parent isotopes in a sample to decay into their daughter isotopes. It's a known time frame. Over a certain period of time, half of the parent isotopes will decay into the daughter isotopes, and we can look at that the ratios of parent to daughter isotopes and determine the approximate age of the sample. So for example, we have at the very beginning, when the organism was still alive and still taking in materials from the world around it, we can see that the fraction of the parent isotope is at its maximum. And then over one half-life, it's going to lose half of that parent isotope. Over two half-lives, it'll only have a quarter of what it used to have. Over three half-lives, it'll have an eighth of what it used to have. And after four half-lives, it'll only have a 16th of the original parent isotope. So the amount of parent isotope decreases over time by 50% each half-life, and the amount of daughter isotope accumulates with each half-life. So we can use various substances for this. The one we hear about most is carbon-14. But carbon-14 is only good for archaeology, not paleontology. It doesn't really go back beyond, I don't know, something like 6,000 or 10,000 years. If you want to use these techniques to date dinosaurs, for example, you have to date the rocks around the fossils and use more robust isotopes. Now, the fossil record itself contains an abundance of organisms, but only approximately 1% of life has been fossilized. So that's like 1% of species that have ever existed are probably not fossilized, and the chance of you becoming fossilized is very slim. You have to fall into a very unique set of circumstances in order to be preserved. But 99% of life has gone extinct. Of all life that has ever been, 99% is gone. Whether it completely died off or gave rise to new species and is gone. That form has disappeared. But organisms that have hard parts, like bones or shells, or even leaves which are resistant to decay or wood, are more likely than others to be preserved. For example, this is an image of a leaf impression in a rock. That leaf smushed into the rock, the mud or the ash hardened into rock. The leaf is gone, but we can see an imprint of that leaf. Now, soft, squishy things like mussel or bacteria or jellyfish, things like that, are rarely preserved because they decay so rapidly or they get beat up so easily that they don't leave a good fossil record behind. I studied fossils for my master's degree. I studied a Cretaceous age fossil locality in Canada and looked at different kinds of fossils. I'm not going to make you memorize all these right now, but we have different kinds of fossils, such as impressions on the upper left, where you still have a carbon film of the original organism on the rock. We have molds and casts, like the image here on the right, where we have a dinosaur footprint, and then rock is filled in that footprint, and when we crack the rock in half, we get a mold and a cast of that dinosaur footprint. My favorite kind of fossil, the ones that I studied, are this type here, which are called permineralized fossils. You might have heard them referred to as petrified. The more correct term is permineralized fossils. And in this case, the cells of this plant have filled in with minerals, and the cell walls are still preserved, so we can actually see the anatomy of this structure. This is actually a root of a plant that's preserved, and these are the cells. You can still see the cells of the root fossilized from the Cretaceous 90 million years ago. And just for comparison, you can compare this to a living root, a root from a modern plant, and see that the structures are very, very similar, and similar processes are occurring. This is a branch coming off of this root. Here's a branch forming off of this fossil root. They do it the same way. So you can compare the anatomy of extinct organisms to those of living organisms. So there's lots of fossils out there, plenty in Arkansas as well. I hope you found some. I hope you do find some, because it's really cool to find fossilize life from millions of years ago. And it's very easy to do if you're in the right spot, such as up around Leslie in Arkansas or Marshall. There's fossils all over the place up there. Now, geologic time, we know life existed in the past, we know it was often different than it is in the present, and we can date organisms using radioactive isotopes and the law of superposition. And we know now that the Earth is around 4.6 billion years old. And we know that we know that life originated at one point. We call this origin of life biogenesis. And we believe this happened sometime around 3.5 billion years ago. That's like 3,500 million years ago, if you want to think about it that way, a really long time ago. So remember, biogenesis is the origin of life. It is different from evolution. These are separate processes. Now, let me step back and just say there are some ideas in the book of how this could have occurred. Because I'm doing this online lecture, we're going to keep that brief, but we can form protocells in the lab, membranes that form like these here. They look like soap bubbles, and they can actually divide and take in new materials and do lots of the things that life does. These are not alive, but it's quite possible that something like these structures that can form naturally may have then given rise to life under certain circumstances. And of course, it's impossible to know for sure because nothing from this era fossilizes very well. As I said, it takes hard parts to fossilize. So we can hypothesize, we might even get a good theory about biogenesis, but we're still a ways away from having a conclusive statement about how life originated on the planet. Either way, there was some point when chemistry became biology. Now, we start with the Precambrian. As I said, this is 88% of the history of the Earth. A huge time frame. So 4.6 billion years ago, the Earth forms. After the Big Bang and all of that, things are cooling off, things are solidifying, the Earth forms 4.6 billion years ago. And then, sometime around 3.5 or so billion years ago, the first life forms form, and we believe those were prokaryotes, organisms that lack a nucleus, lack membrane-bound organelles. It wasn't until about 1.8 billion years ago that we had the evolution of the eukaryote, which we will talk about a little bit in the chapter on bacteria. And then towards the end of the Precambrian, which is a huge span of time, but towards the end we get the evolution of more complex organisms, including some of the early animals and things. I want to point out that we do have some fossils of bacteria from the Precambrian, and even in Arkansas we have evidence of structures like these. Now these are structures produced by living cyanobacteria, known as a stromatolite. These are basically rocks, but the rocks that are deposited by these bacteria, and the bacteria live on the upper surface of the rock. And pardon me, my phone's going off. Every generation, this bacteria adds another layer of this calcium carbonate material to the stromatolite, growing it larger and larger. And so they get bigger and bigger. And we can find fossils of these in Precambrian rocks, and we can find them in rocks in Arkansas as well, if you go up towards Marshall once again. These fossils have been produced since the Precambrian all the way up to the modern era. I won't test you on the names of the things that I'm not writing down, but I just wanted to point that out. So we'll mention this later, but I do want to mention it again now, and you may have heard it in Bio 1. Eukaryotes were a huge leap forward in the evolution of life, and what we believe happened is a prokaryote. There are two prokaryotes, basically. Some may have had some more complex structures inside, more like a a eukaryote, but we're not quite there yet. And one of these cells engulfed the other, basically took it in via endocytosis. And when that occurred, the cell that was brought in, instead of being digested, lived with that cell, one cell living inside of another. We call that endosymbiosis. We'll talk about that in the bacterial chapter, like I said. But this may have occurred several times through the course of the evolution of eukaryotes. And eventually those cells that were engulfed became organelles rather than individual free-living cells. And we ended up with these complex eukaryotic cells. And the clearest evidence of that is in the evolution of the chloroplast and the mitochondrion, who were engulfed into cells. They and are still there today, but they are not free-living bacteria anymore. The bacteria that gave rise to the mitochondrion has evolved into an organelle that still has its own DNA, still has ribosomes like those of bacteria, but it can't live on its own outside the cell. The same can be said for the chloroplast. So this occurred in the Precambrian, this process which gave rise to the eukaryotes, and we'll talk more about it in the chapter on bacteria. So during the Precambrian here in Arkansas, we were underwater. It was an ocean. Arkansas has spent most of its time as an ocean, actually, in the geologic history of the Earth. But we can see that there were lots of volcanic activity in the area of Missouri and northern Arkansas, and this volcanic activity caused a dome to form. We can see this drawing here showing an uprising because of all that all that volcanic activity pushing the Earth upward. This is what we call the Ozark Dome. This dome gave rise to the Ozark Mountains. So it pushed rocks straight up in the air. And that's why if you're in the Ozarks today, you'll see that the rock layers are nice and straight. If you're driving through a road cut, the rock layers are parallel in the Ozark Mountains. Whereas down here in the Ouachita Mountains, the rocks are bent and warped, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. So the Ozark Mountains are forming. The reason that this dome, this one almost like a huge mountain, became individual mountains like we see today in the Ozarks is because rivers and streams cut the individual mountains out as erosion took place. So we leave the Cambrian or the Precambrian and we enter the Cambrian, which is the first stage of the Paleozoic era. And this is a very important time for biology because the Cambrian Explosion takes place where many modern phyla of animals appear. But I want to make it clear it's not an explosion like it happened very quickly. This took 540 million years. It just seems quite quickly when you look at the geologic record because you have layers with few organisms and a few layers later you have lots of organisms, but that's 500 million years of time. But by the Paleozoic, all of the living phyla of animals are present. Every phylum we have today was around during the Paleozoic, the beginning of the Paleozoic. And if you've ever seen fossils from the Burgess Shale in Canada, we have amazing fossils from this period. Fossils that even show soft parts, which is really rare. So if we go back to the Precambrian, we had the evolution of prokaryotes. I didn't mention this, I can talk about it later, but we had the evolution or the creation of atmospheric oxygen during the Precambrian, which then allowed eukaryotes to really take off. Eukaryotes evolved shortly after atmospheric oxygen became rich. We have the evolution of multicellularity in the Precambrian, all these things. But it's not till almost the very end of the Precambrian that animals show up. And then animals really diversify as we cross into the Paleozoic. So the Cambrian Explosion brought us all animal phyla that are around today. Another thing that happened is we see all the major body plans of animals existing during this time. So different ways of existing, heads and tails and things like that. Including lots of body plans like this organism down here that don't exist today, that went extinct. Lots of experimentation through the process of evolution. So if we look at this diagram, we can see here's the border of the Paleozoic, the Paleozoic and the Precambrian. Several organisms existed before the Paleozoic, so sponges and cnidarians, for example, and maybe the beginnings of mollusks. But we see a lot of these other organisms like chordates, which we are, echinoderms, arthropods, showing up during this Cambrian explosion. Another thing that's happening during this time, during the Paleozoic, the continents are moving closer and closer together and smashing into one another. We can see here the formation of a large supercontinent known as Pangaea. And the brown areas are showing where continents were hitting one another, causing geologic activity. And if you look really closely, right in this area, South America and Africa are colliding with North America. And if we zoom in on that, we can see right here, here's Arkansas. And here's the Ozark Dome that I mentioned earlier, a big uprising of volcanic activity that formed the Ozark Mountains. Meanwhile, South America and Africa are pushing into North America, and they are crushing rock and folding rock and forming the Ouachita mountain range that runs through the rest of the state, basically, the southern half of the state. And those rocks are folded and bent because of those impacts with South America and Africa. So what happens during the Paleozoic? So we mentioned earlier in the Precambrian, we have the origin of life, we have the oxygen levels increasing, photosynthesis happening basically, and we have the evolution of eukaryotes. Then we hit the Cambrian, we have an explosion of life. So we have during the Cambrian explosion, lots of animal phyla, all the current living animal phyla exist by the end of the Cambrian explosion. And as we continue through the Paleozoic, more and more things occur. First of all, fish evolve, and then after that, animals start invading the land. We have the colonization of land by animals and by plants during this time. So towards the end of the Paleozoic, the Permian, for the first time in a while, Arkansas is above sea level. So Arkansas was dry at this time. And the formation of this supercontinent Pangaea is completed, and that really changes climate on the planet. Having a large landmass means that the middle of the landmass is dry, and all the shallow oceans that used to be around the individual continents are gone because they've been crushed as the land masses join together, and it really changed the climate, changed the earth, destroyed lots of habitat. So the end of this Permian period is actually marked by the most massive extinction known in the fossil record. We always hear about the dinosaur extinction. This one was much, much greater. We lost 96% of the known diversity in the oceans, and 70% of life on land disappeared. That's plant and animal species gone as the climate drastically changed, as the geography drastically changed, as that supercontinent Pangaea formed on the Earth. So we can see this here. Towards the end of the Paleozoic, Pangaea is fully formed. We have that massive extinction, and then we go into the Mesozoic. And during the Mesozoic, the continents begin to break up again and drift more and more into their current forms until we get to the Cenozoic, the present era. So I didn't type out the word Pangaea, but there it is listed here. It's the supercontinent. And I want to point out that, once again, all of the little oceans that used to be between these continents were destroyed, and those shallow oceans are where a lot of diversity comes from. Those shallow oceans that get lots of sunlight, lots of photosynthesis, lots of food, drive very large communities, and they all disappeared for the most part. And this huge continent formed where there's going to be lots of rain near the coast, but it will become very dry towards the middle of this continent. So that really changed the evolution of life. It pushed life to evolve into a more terrestrial habitat. They had to rely more on less rain, for example. They had to rely more on living in drier environments than they used to. So now let's step into the Mesozoic. The end of the Paleozoic occurs. We have that huge extinction. Pangaea has formed. And now we enter the Mesozoic, which includes the Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous. I'll have you learn the Cretaceous because that's when dinosaurs went extinct at the end of the Cretaceous. But this is the age of the dinosaurs, and Arkansas is mostly, at least half, underwater at this time. If we look at a map of Arkansas, the southern half and the eastern half of the state are under the Gulf of Mexico, basically. The Ouachita Mountains are partially above sea level, and a lot of the Ozarks are above sea level at that time. So the only place we really find dinosaur fossils from this era are on the edge of the ocean here, where footprints and bones have been found. So things that happen during the Mesozoic. Mammals evolve, and they show up in the fossil record. They show up in the Jurassic. I won't test you on that as long as you know they showed up in the Mesozoic. And another thing that happens during the Mesozoic is the evolution of flowering plants. Before this time, we had conifers, so gymnosperms, so seed plants like that, and we had ferns and mosses and things like that on the planet. But for the first time, we have flowering plants, which is a huge influence on animal life. And flowering plants become the dominant plant form up to the modern era. The last thing that happens in the Mesozoic is a large extinction event. Around 65 million years ago, the dinosaurs and some plant life and other things go extinct, and the mammals then really get a fresh start, and they really branch out, evolve, get bigger, and lead to the animals we know today. So that extinction event took place here off the Yucatan Peninsula. A large asteroid is thought to have impacted the Earth there. We can find evidence of that, and threw lots of dust and debris into the atmosphere, causing severe climate change, shading the Earth, stopping a lot of photosynthesis, cooling the Earth, putting a lot of pollutants in the air. Lots of problems would have started from this massive impact, and the dinosaurs did not survive it. Except for those few dinosaurs that gave rise to the birds, of course. The birds you can think of as living dinosaurs that did survive this event. The last part of the geologic history I want to mention is the Cenozoic. That's the modern era. Excuse me. And Arkansas was partially covered again by ocean early on during this time. But it has since receded in more recent times. Large mammals evolved during this time. The first hominids evolve, and eventually the first humans. We'll talk about hominids later. But think of like organisms that are human-like the great apes and things. During the Quaternary period, which you don't have to memorize, but we had in more recent times during the Cenozoic an ice age. Glaciers covered much of North America, and they would encroach into North America, then recede back again. And I don't know what they consider it now. I know some people consider the ice age still to be present because there are still polar ice caps, but nothing like the ice ages where ice encroached over much of North America. And then around 0.9 million years ago, modern humans appear. So we can see Arkansas here, the Gulf of Mexico, way down here at the bottom of the state. We have ice that appeared all the way up towards Crowley's Ridge up in the northern Arkansas, but it never really came down into Arkansas. So that was kind of a rush through the history of the Earth and the history of life. So I thought what I would do here to help you understand what you should know from this chapter for now is I I put most of it on this diagram. I didn't put the origin of prokaryotes. You should be familiar with that one as well. You can map that onto this diagram yourself. But we have the evolution of prokaryotes, the evolution of photosynthesis, evolution of eukaryotes, multicellularity. And remember, you don't need to know the dates. You need to know what era, or I should say what eon they occurred in this case. So in this case, the Precambrian. So the Precambrian, they occurred then. And then for all of these above, I'd like you to know what era they occurred in. So the evolution of land plants, the evolution of land animals. You should also be familiar with the Cambrian Explosion, which is not on here, but I think you should know where that goes right here at the beginning of the Cambrian, the beginning of the Paleozoic. So land animals, land plants, and then we have the massive Permian extinction that occurs right here. You should be familiar with that. The evolution of mammals, flowering plants, extinction of the dinosaurs, and way up here, the first modern human. The other things I'd like you to be familiar with are when the Ozark Mountains formed and when the Ouachita Mountains formed and why, the formation of Pangaea and volcanic activity in the Ozarks. So I didn't go into tons of detail here on those things, but I'd like you to know when they occurred. And for example, the Ouachitas, I might ask you, why are the rocks of the Ouachita Mountains bent while the rocks in the Ozark Mountains are flat? And you should be able to give me a one-sentence answer to that. You don't have to go in depth, a one-sentence answer to explain that information. So that will wrap up this lecture over the history of the Earth. I recommend you look at the geologic timescale in your book or draw out your own and map on those bullet points that I should say those arrows that I specifically said you should know this, and the couple of other ones that I pointed out while going over that slide, such as the evolution of prokaryotes and the Permian extinction, things like that. Put those on there as well. And be prepared for a question on that on an exam. I may ask, when was the era of the dinosaurs? And you would say, oh, Mesozoic. When did humans evolve? And you'd say, oh, Cenozoic. When did life forms come out on land, or animals on land? And you'd say, oh, Paleozoic. And I might ask you what happened first, the evolution of animals on land or plants on land. And as you saw from that diagram, it looks like the fossil evidence suggests animals came out on land before we had full-fledged plants on the shore. So be familiar with the relative positions of those things, which happened first, which happened second, which happened last, and what eras they occurred in.